Hi, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. What you are about to see is a slightly different episode because there are actually slides in this one, because this is a recording of the talk that I did in conjunction with Creswell Crags for their Festival of Folklore on the 19th of December. And in it, we're going to have a look at why we tell ghost stories at Christmas, and also we're going to get into why people might have used the witch marks at Creswell Crags in the caves to try and deter ghosts. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you have a gloriously spooky time, and I also hope that you have a very Merry Christmas. So I give you my talk with Creswell Crags, why do we tell ghost stories at Christmas? Cheerio. We are obviously going to start off with a mention of A Christmas Carol, because it wouldn't be a talk about ghost stories and Christmas without it. And it is easy to think of A Christmas Carol as the first Christmas ghost story. And if you think about it, the story doesn't work if you remove either the ghosts or the Christmas setting. And I genuinely think that the best adaptation is the Blackadder version. So if anyone disagrees, you can keep your Muppets. I'll have Blackadder, thanks. And for many people, the work of the writer M.R. James is inextricably linked to Christmas as well, both through his stories and the BBC's A Ghost Story for Christmas. But why is this? Because you would think ghost stories would make more sense at Halloween, or perhaps they wouldn't, because Midwinter is traditionally associated with ghost stories, as we're going to find out why, and other tales of strange things that lurk in the darkness. So why do we tell ghost stories at this time of year? Why do ghosts continue to preoccupy us? And if anyone's ever been to any of my talks before, you'll know that ghosts are where I've got a bee in me bonnet. And also, are there ways to keep troublesome spirits at bay at Midwinter? So these are all the things that we're going to have a look at today. Now, there is a slightly thorny issue of Midwinter versus Christmas, which came up quite a lot while I was researching this. And are we going to use the terms interchangeably? Now, some will tell you that the church instituted the Christmas festival to replace an ancient pagan celebration, but that isn't entirely the case. And I'm going to be drawn quite a lot for this part on Ronald Hutton's excellent book, Stations of the Sun, which I highly recommend for contextual background, because we do need to understand where Christmas comes from in order to figure out why people would tell ghost stories at this particular time of year. So the first mention on record of Christmas being the 25th of December actually appears in 354 in Rome in the calendar of Philocalus. And don't do what I did and go, oh my God, is that BC or AD? It's clearly AD, people. And a Christian writer, the scriptor Cyrus, explained in the late 4th century that pagans were celebrating the birth of the sun on the 25th of December, but Christians were already taking part in those festivities, so they would celebrating it as well. So as Christians were already celebrating it, it made sense to specify the same date for the nativity. Now, again, we'll never really understand the reason and why, but I think that seems like the height of efficiency rather than trying to take over a festival and replace it with another one. Now, many people do think that this same pagan festival is a remnant of an ancient past, but actually it only dates to 274, instituted by the Emperor Aurelian. And he was a big fan of the sun god, which is Sol, which is represented here in this mosaic from the Vatican. And this particular cult, which Aurelian was trying to make the official cult, actually celebrated their annual festival in the summer. And his Sol Invictus festival actually revolved around games held every 4 years in mid-October. So we'll never really know if the scriptor Cyrus was right about why they picked the 25th of December, and if not, why they chose Midwinter for the nativity. Ultimately, it's just one of those things we'll never know. But this does bring us to another Roman feast that you probably have heard of, and that's Saturnalia. And a lot of people think that Christmas derives from this one. It also involved closing shops and schools, exchanging presents and playing games. And from what I've read in some sources, people decorated a lot with greenery and so on as well. But Saturnalia actually occurred for the 5 to 6 days after the 17th of December. So we would actually be in Saturnalia now. And it was to honour the great god of time, Saturn. It does seem somehow fitting, if you ask me, that this year's winter solstice on Monday will actually see this great conjunction between the planet Saturn and Jupiter, and they're going to form what will look like a huge Christmas star in the sky. Well, because where else would you find planets? But the Romans didn't just celebrate Saturnalia, because the Romans do love their festivals, And they had Saturnalia, which was all about like misrule and turning things on their head and just generally being quite bawdy. And then they also had the calendar from the 1st to the 3rd of January, which was basically New Year. So while Saturnalia kind of just disappeared from view, New Year celebrations have pretty much continued relatively uninterrupted ever since. And I dare say they will be more vigorous this year as we all say cheerio to 2020 and hope that 2021 is a bit more stable, for want of a better word. So it's quite unlikely, in my opinion, that the tradition for telling ghost stories came from Saturnalia or indeed any other Roman celebration. So could we then instead say that ghost stories come from the pagan celebrations of Midwinter in the British Isles? And this is where I'm going to be a bit contrary and say that unlike some writers who say that we absolutely can know how people celebrated Midwinter in ancient times, we actually can't because there's no documentary evidence. People have tried, but we will ultimately will never know. Obviously, this is Stonehenge on the summer solstice, and this is one of the few bits of evidence that people did celebrate Midwinter. And the problem here is a handful of these Neolithic monuments and indeed passage graves are oriented towards midsummer or midwinter, which does indicate that there was a ritual importance of the sun, but not all of the other monuments follow suit. And this makes it really quite difficult to spot patterns, to discern any obvious midwinter ritualistic practices. And really annoyingly, none of the ancient Roman writers saw fit to record any of the seasonal festivals that were held in Northwest Europe. And any of the early literature from the British Isles doesn't really emphasize it either. The only one who does mention it is Pliny. And if you've ever listened to my podcast, you'll know how often Pliny comes up with some of these really bizarre theories. And he writes about the link between druids and mistletoe. And even then, he gets it wrong because that's Pliny for you. So we can instead move forward a little bit in time to see how people celebrated Christmas as the Great Midwinter Festival, and until 1038, Midwinter appears in Anglo-Saxon literature to refer to the Nativity. So there's this long-running connection of almost 7 centuries between the two festivals at this point. And Alfred the Great was the one who actually established the 12 days of Christmas in 877 so that servants could actually have some time off to celebrate the midwinter period. So if anybody's asking you to work over Christmas, you can say, Alfred the Great says I shouldn't, and see what happens. Now, Bede and Snorri Sturluson, both massive names obviously in the folklore world, do share some consensus that it was the winter solstice that was also a really important festival in ancient Scandinavia, and that's ultimately where they think the word Yule comes from. So basically what we can kind of derive from all of this historical confusion is that midwinter, Christmas, Yule, and the winter solstice are all a really important period of time. But if we are going to talk about Scandinavia and Yule, it is quite worth mentioning, I think, our first glimmer of darkness at Christmas, because that is why we're here. We are here to unpick exactly why tales of ghosts and goblins are so attractive at this time of year. And the first example that we're going to have a look at comes from Icelandic folklore, and I'd like you to meet the Jólakötturinn. And this is from the short animation that Danny Elfman worked on about the Yule Cat, which is what Jólakötturinn, I always get that name wrong, because I've only ever seen it written down. I don't know how it sounds, but he worked on this animation about the Yule Cat in 2017. You can watch it online. I've put the address there on the screen. It's like 2 minutes long and it's really, really good. But in Icelandic folklore, the giant Yule Cat prowls around at Christmas looking for victims. And unlike Krampus, who you may be aware of from popular culture now, who's St. Nicholas's horned colleague in Alpine regions, the Yule Cat isn't actually there to encourage better behaviour. Instead, he prowls around peering into people's windows to see who got new clothes for Christmas. And the Yule Cat then eats anybody who doesn't get new clothes, which may seem like a really strange modus operandi, but there is a reason behind it. And for those who finished their household chores before Christmas, they would get new clothes as a present. And if you didn't get new clothes, it basically implied that you'd been too lazy to finish your chores, hence the Yule Cat ate you. Now, the oldest written versions of this tale only date to the 19th century, although some people think it dates back to the Dark Ages. And if you think about it, getting your weaving and spinning finished in time to make new clothes for Christmas would be a good incentive to work harder anyway. But this does mark one of the problems that folklorists essentially have when there is no tangible evidence for a tradition how do you know that one actually existed? And many people do turn to writers from the Victorian period, but to say that their research method is a little bit slapdash would be a compliment to them. That's all I'm going to say about them, though. So we do have records, thankfully, about how people celebrated during the Middle Ages and the Tudor period. So this is a recreation, obviously, because it's a photograph, of how people decorated in Tudor times. And the fashions here ran towards busy entertainment. So there's not really much in the record to say that ghost stories were much of a thing, but it does sow the seeds for our ideas about Gothic tales being told by a Christmas fireside, because what would happen is the wealthy would then hire players to come in and do plays and musical interludes for their household. And on top of that, you then had musicians and mummers who would then wear disguises and masks and things, and they were really popular during the late Middle Ages, and they would essentially go around entertaining everybody. And they don't relate to the ghost story specifically, but they do show that there's this desire for escapism and imagination during the Christmas period. So it's not beyond the bounds of reason to suggest that the frivolity of the Christmas period might have been there to hold the darkness at the door and to kind of suspend the somewhat harsh realities of the season. And it should be pointed out that after the Restoration, Charles II came along and he's like, no, we're not having the masked balls. We're going to have a lot of gambling. So it became a really big period for gambling under Charles II, although storytelling and party games did remain popular with the working classes. So it does show that people felt this need to gather together because it's getting darker. And in a way, it's almost a bit like the modern reason why people watch horror films. It's like that vicarious scare through a story rather than actually having to have one yourself. And I should point out that the stories they were telling were not the fluffy Hallmark card stories beloved by Christmas movies. These are very dark stories steeped in darkness and the coldness of a winter night, and they just ooze with death and creepiness. And while there is little concrete evidence that a continuous tradition existed before Dickens, there are hints that the concept dates to Shakespeare's era, at least. Now, I'm not going to say Shakespeare invented them because, like, we know that he apparently invented everything else. But this one actually comes from Christopher Marlowe's The Jews of Malta from 1589. And Barabbas says, "Now I remember those old women's words, who in my wealth would tell me winter's tales and speak of spirits and ghosts that glide by night." So as early as 1589, we have written evidence from Marlowe, albeit in a play, that winter tales were associated with spirits and ghosts and so on. Obviously, Shakespeare is not one to be outdone by this. So in 1611, he then writes The Winter's Tale, which engages with the dangers lurking in the dark. And Mamilius proclaims, "A sad tale's best for winter. I have one of sprites and goblins." So again, it's this link between winter, because they're often called winter tales rather than Christmas ghost stories. And again, it's all about this idea of goblins and supernatural creatures and so on. And incidentally, even Joseph Glanville, who's famous for his 1681 treatise about witchcraft, he puts winter's tales and old wives' tales into the same category, i.e. nonsense, and that they're believed only by gullible fools. Now, in many ways, midwinter does become a more opportune time to tell ghost stories than Halloween. And the period around October 31st is linked with death, yes, and the walking abroad of spirits through the Celtic festival of Samhain. And a lot of people will talk about how, the veil's thinner between the worlds, but like veils by their very nature are thin, so that's possibly not the best wording. But it is at midwinter that the nights they're colder, they're longer, and we're more aware of our own mortality. And yes, midwinter also is a time of celebration. You're welcoming back the sun, but you would still have to work quite long, hard months to slog through before you see the first emergence of spring. And we see this even now, because January and February both feel like they're about 6 months long each. So it's the same sort of feeling. The only difference is we're just like bored at work. We're not actually dying of starvation or anything, as people centuries ago may have been. And also remember that midwinter is the shortest day of the year, so which means it's also the longest night. So it might feel like a form of endurance test in earlier centuries when food was scarce and you only really had candlelight to hold the shadows back. But I should point out, though, that people were telling ghost stories and sharing ghost belief well before the 19th century. And it wasn't necessarily at Christmas and midwinter. It was just part of the background fabric of both literature and even everyday life. So this is a really famous example, and some people call it the first modern ghost story. And it's by one Daniel Defoe, who you may better know as the author of Robinson Crusoe. And I love the length of the title is phenomenal. And it's called A True Relation of the Apparition of One Mrs. Veal the Next Day After Her Death to One Mrs. Bargrave of Canterbury. And it's a so-called factional account that came from 1706, and it appeared to make ghosts kind of like almost expected or understandable within human experience. And even now, there's some people actually believe this is a true story that actually happened. Other people obviously read it and go, well, it's Daniel Defoe, it's probably not real. But it does just kind of show how this ghost belief is cracking on. And then we can also look at something like the incident of the Tedworth drummer, which was an alleged poltergeist episode in the West Country in 1661. And I only mention this one because I'm not going to go through like a million ghost stories, but I'm mentioning this one because Samuel Pepys mentions it in his diary on Christmas Day in 1667. And it was because his wife read him the story. So in a way, you kind of think, was Pepys's Christmas Day account of a factual tale of a supposed haunting actually an early example of a Christmas ghost story, or was it just coincidence? We never know, but it is quite an interesting link between the two. And we are at this point going to move forward to the first accepted incarnations of the Christmas ghost story, which, yes, does relate to Dickens. So this is the woodcut involving Ignorance and Want, which comes from the original illustrated one, which is illustrated by John Leach. And there is a 50-year period between about 1790 and 1840 when employers just cut the Christmas holidays back. So there's none of this 12 days off thing. They would just cut right back. And a lot of the time, some places of work were literally only closed on Christmas Day itself because Boxing Day didn't become a bank holiday until 1871. And thanks to the 1833 Factory Act, only Christmas Day and Good Friday were considered days off alongside Sundays. So really, Scrooge being annoyed at Bob Cratchit wanting time off over Christmas suddenly doesn't seem quite so strange. Wasn't the case everywhere. And with some of the areas around traditional industry in the North and the West Country, workers actually still did observe the old holidays. So you do have a bit of a regional division there, much as you do now. And Christmas celebrations had been on the decline pretty much since England's brief flirtation with being a republic when the Puritan Oliver Cromwell banned Christmas carols and tried to purge Christmas of its festive fanfare. Now, the Puritans decided that it all had to go because it didn't actually say in the Bible that God even wanted humanity to celebrate Christ's birth. So they were like, well, if it doesn't say it in the Bible, then we shouldn't do it. And they banned Christmas in 1644. Which always makes me think of Alan Rickman in Robin Hood when he cancels Christmas. And it was actually, as you might imagine, the Merry Monarch himself, Charles II, who brings it all back again in 1660 following the Restoration. But I don't necessarily think it will be the same as the Tudor celebrations because of the way that he obviously stripped things back and replaced a lot of the festivities just with gambling and so on. So it is really difficult to find evidence of a continuous form of ghost storytelling during Midwinter as a form of celebration. And people might have told them to while away the time because obviously there is the reference to them in Shakespeare and Marlowe, but there's no specific record of them being included within the festivities. So when you do hear people glorify this pre-Victorian era of Christmas celebrations, you do have to actually go back a fair way to find it. But I should point out that that people sort of then as now were worried about the impact of industrialization, and they were looking back to this romanticized view of the past. So nostalgia has always been a motivating factor for quite a lot of changes throughout the years, and Christmas became the ideal opportunity to basically bring back domestic bliss into the calendar. And that innovative thinker, Prince Albert, was the one who masterminded an image of himself with the royal family gathered at Windsor to celebrate the season. So where earlier royal Christmases might include bawdy behaviour or the theme of misrule, which is far closer to Saturnalia, the Victorian Christmas became a time for family and reconciliation. And this is indeed a painting of their Christmas tree for Victorian Albert that came out at the time. So where else would you find this desire to hold back the spirits in the dark and to fan the flames of charity and goodwill in order to chase away ghosts and evil creatures? Should point out very, very quickly that it's quite interesting to note that very few of the Christmas traditions and symbology that was essentially begun or resurrected by the Victorians had much of a Christian context, aside perhaps from Christmas cards or scenes of the Nativity. And this is an example of the very, very, very first Christmas card from 1843. And it was essentially born out of necessity because the sender was sick of writing letters to everyone, giving them all of his news. So he just basically had this family portrait put on a card and then sent it to people to save himself having to write them letters. And this is quite a notable date because it's also the same time as the huge success of A Christmas Carol. So all of a sudden, people now have a thing that they can do for Christmas. And the 19th century was characterized by a lot of things, most of them bad. And indeed, one of them was a hearty appetite for all things commercial. And obviously, Christmas then got a makeover as a result. So when you say that people have said recently that Christmas has become too commercial, that's actually the Victorians' fault. So many of the decorating traditions concentrated on symbols from the natural world, which is why we have things like robin, snow, mistletoe, holly, all that kind of thing. And in a way, this renewed focus on the natural world kind of makes you think, ooh, are they also thinking about what lurks beyond the windows on these cold winter nights? Obviously, if you're as obsessed with ghosts as me, that is exactly what you will find yourself thinking. But on to Dickens and the ghost story. One thing I would like to point out is Dickens never really intended to write a Christmas book called A Christmas Carol. He was actually going to write a pamphlet because he just read a government report about child labour, and he was going to write this pamphlet called An Appeal to the People of England on Behalf of the Poor Man's Child. Obviously, it's not really that snappy a title. And he'd planned it and then realised he could make more of a point if he did it in fiction instead. So I think he dashed it off in about 6 days or something like that. And he basically then immortalised the story of this miser who's terrified essentially into changing his ways by 3 spirits in the space of a single night. And you can only hope that one of any of those 3 spirits might be free to work their magic this year. But why did Dickens actually decide to popularise the ghost story of all the genres that he could have chosen? He had actually done another version of A Christmas Carol a little bit earlier, but I can't remember if it's set at Christmas or not, but a guy's basically, what's the word? Hinted at that he should change his ways, and it's by goblins, so he's very much gone originally for the winter's tale element, but by the time you get A Christmas Carol, it's ghosts. And the Gothic novel at this point was pretty much considered like populist nonsense. It was kind of like the Pulp Fiction of its day, which is why you find it lampooned by Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey. So it does seem like a bit of a weird choice for Dickens, who's normally such a realist. And I would say that his motivation ultimately was in getting the point across, and the ghosts give him a really simple and efficient way of doing so. So their supernatural abilities then become the driving force of the narrative. And I would argue that the Christmas ghost story is basically born out of this growing desire for festive traditions among the population, because it had been like a growing movement for a few years. There's a national preoccupation with ghost belief anyway. And then Dickens basically needed a plot point. So I think you add them all together and you get the Christmas ghost story. And this is just my own personal opinion, so it could be wrong, but I do find it's quite interesting that A Christmas Carol comes out in 1843, and then 5 years later, spiritualism emerges in its rawest form in New York State in America, and then that's brought back to England in the 1850s, and it's really popular among the working classes of the North. And it's both a religion and a worldview that then brings ghosts out of the darkness and into the sitting room through the seance. So, and I love this image where someone's actually showing you how you can like levitate a table like in a fake way for a seance, which I think will be a marvelous party trick at any boring Christmas do. So there you go. But in the Victorian era, the line between the living and the dead was always a bit of an indistinct one. And if the dead could be contacted by a medium inside a cabinet or a circle of sitters clutching hands in the dark, why could they not be conjured through tales by the fireside? So I think if you combine the dark winter's tales of Marlowe and Shakespeare, and then you look at all this other stuff around spiritualism and Dickens, the conditions are basically ripe for the Christmas ghost story tradition to actually take root. And take root it did. Because in the 19th century, you suddenly get authors like Algernon Blackwood, J.H. Riddell, and E.F. Benson all write Christmas ghost stories, which anticipates the later popularity of writers like M.R. James and A.M. Burrage. Not all the stories are actually set at Christmas. Those of James certainly aren't, but they're still creepy nonetheless. But there is a really good one that you might want to have a look at after this, called Between the Lights by E.F. Benson, which is set during the festive season, and it actually includes its own description of telling ghost stories at Christmas. So it becomes quite meta that it's a ghost story at Christmas about telling ghost stories at Christmas. And it even includes its own description where it says about telling ghost stories at Christmas as was proper. And the real horror of this tale comes from the fact that it's supposedly telling a true ghost story firsthand as part of the event. And this motif is then repeated in Smee by A.M. Burrage, in which a character tells a true tale of his encounter with a ghost during a game of hide and seek. And it is actually really quite creepy. Jerome K. Jerome then comes along and publishes an entire anthology of Christmas ghost stories in 1891 called Told After Supper. And this is where he actually really explicitly engages with the idea of ghost stories at Christmas, because he declares that nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about spectres. It is a genial festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood. So, man after my own heart, really. But you also have to think about Henry James's famous 1898 novella, The Turn of the Screw. That begins with men sharing ghost stories by the fire on Christmas Eve. And while the story's then gone on to become quite famous, both through its adaptation as The Innocents in 1961 and more recently through The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix, it's quite easy to forget that it was once a Christmas ghost story itself. Yet it is perhaps Montague, Rhodes, James who's most associated with the ghost story at Christmas in the 20th century. And he used to tell ghost stories by the fire to his students. And then the BBC sort of picked up this idea. So what almost became like a tradition just for them then became like a national tradition in 1971 with A Ghost Story for Christmas. And every year the BBC showed an adaptation of a classic ghost story. 5 were by M.R. James. 1 was Dickens's The Signalman, which in my humble opinion is one of the finest ghost stories ever written, and 2 were original screenplays. The series was resurrected in 2005 by BBC 4, and I would say that the 2013 adaptation of the tractate Midoth by Mark Gatiss was perhaps the most notable attempt to resurrect the tradition, but none of the 21st century versions are quite as gloriously creepy as that 1976 version of The Signalman starring Denham Elliott. But this is where we're getting why do people tell them though? And I think it is quite useful to note that these literary examples are all either ghost stories that are set at Christmas, or they're fictional ghost stories that are told by writers at Christmas. So we don't actually know if there was a corresponding trend among ordinary people to actually tell each other ghost stories, or if they preferred to consume popular literature at the time instead, in much the same way that, people sit down and watch like the Christmas Doctor Who and so on now, or the Queen's Speech or whatever. It's like, is that what people were doing with ghost stories back in the day? As to why people still have a fondness for them even now, sometimes it feels like it's become a tradition because people tell us that it's a tradition. And I actually took part in a festive event yesterday where we were all telling ghost stories for Christmas. And it was clear by the number of attendees that this has been embraced with a great deal of enthusiasm. But why would it not be? Because Christmas is pretty much the last great fanfare before what you are known as the dead days, which are those days in the calendar between Christmas and New Year. And we recognise them as being the day where you don't know what time it is, you don't know what day it is, and you're totally sick of turkey sandwiches. But what better to liven that particular time of the year up with a ghost story or two? If you made ghost stories a year round, but it is a good time to do them at Christmas. But what I would love to see more of is people telling their own ghost stories, perhaps passing on tales of unexplained things that they've heard or seen or felt, and thus contributing to both the rich fabric of ghost belief and personal experience. But then they would also be adding to the growing corpus of contemporary folklore as well. So I would personally like to see the tradition take that path. Whether it will or not remains to be seen. But we've looked so far at where the tradition for ghost stories at Midwinter may come from. And indeed, there is something in them that I do think speaks of the dark spirits that people try to hold back by the fireside, which neatly brings us on to the ways that people have used in the past to deter malevolent spirits over the centuries. And from planting rowan trees by their door to keep witches out, to hanging horseshoes above the door to keep evil out, people have used a whole range of protective devices known as apotropaic magic as their first line of defense against both the dark arts and rogue evil spirits. And this is an example of the witch marks from Creswell Crags. And the word apotropaic, and it has taken me a really long time to be able to pronounce that properly, comes from the Greek term apotropein, meaning to turn away. And a common form of defense is this apparent witch mark. And they're more commonly found in medieval buildings. You get them in barns, churches, houses, and they essentially survive because they're carved into woodwork or particularly stone, which is marvelous at preserving them. And they're usually near entrance points. You get them on windowsills, by fireplaces, doorways in particular, things like that. And they're all those parts of the house because they're all thresholds. So they're all places where they're quite vulnerable in a way. And you think that, you know, evil might come in at any of these points, so we've got to keep them out. Obviously nowadays we would use like burglar alarms and stuff. In those days, you know, you had these instead. And this is going to become important why you put them at thresholds in a moment. And Owen Davies and Kerry Holbrook, in their spellbound books that accompanied the exhibition of the same name at the Ashmolean, actually explain that these marks might be called witch marks, but there's no real evidence that they were only for deterring witches, and they might just be like general protection devices instead. And many of the marks do sit individually, so you couldn't think it was a Mason mark or someone's initials. And alternatively, you can tell that they're not Mason marks because they've been made in this really quite crude way, unlike the really careful and considered marks that you would get of a craftsman. Obviously, it's quite unusual to find them in caves. Wookey Hole has some as well. And they were at first assumed to be graffiti, but they obviously are now understood to be these apotropaic marks. And unfortunately, unlike witch bottles, which does have some stuff written about them, nothing was written down about them at the time. So there's not contemporary sources explaining what the marks are, which marks you use and why. There's no like user's guide or, you know, witch marks for dummies available, which is a shame. So what's known about them is basically comes from deductions by the people who study them. And this is a problem that folklorists basically often run into, because we can only draw conclusions from things that have been done often enough to then leave a pattern in the archaeological record, which means something's been done often enough that there is a record to be left, which does explain why it's so difficult to find any evidence of traditions around Christmas or indeed ghost stories at Midwinter, because these are oral traditions, so they're not written down. So we have to try and understand them as best that we can. Now, there is going to be a talk about the witch marks at Creswell Crags on Monday, which I will be attending. So if you want to learn more about them, then I would recommend that. But I'm going to talk to them here about how they relate to ghost belief, since we're already talking about ghosts and like that's my thing. So this is quite a common witch mark that you might find, and it's the conjoined V. So, you know, who might you turn to for help in driving away evil or indeed containing it? Well, the Virgin of Virgins, the Virgin Mary herself, was often called upon using this particular mark. And it does help to date the mark, because it's obviously going to be it can't be a pre-Christian mark, so it's clearly going to be from AD. So that's quite helpful. But you do see these everywhere, and it looks a lot like a W. So that's quite a popular apotropaic mark. And in a recent talk about witch marks that I attended with Treadwell's bookshop, archaeologist and apotropaic mark expert Wayne Perkins actually raised the possibility that ciphers for the Virgin Mary were used during a time when it wasn't really feasible to openly show your devotion to her. So you couldn't have a statue, you couldn't carry any actual icons around, but you could add her symbols to the space around you instead. So could these marks inside the caves date to a period of religious persecution? It would certainly point to periods in England's history when it wasn't safe to venerate Mary. It could also show how much protection the people needed, given the number of them found on the walls. And this is where we basically bring things back to the caves, because the marks appear on the walls and the ceilings. And as I said before, they were assumed originally to be graffiti. And if they're protective marks when they're found inside homes and they're designed to keep evil spirits out, then what role could they possibly play at the crags? So that's what we're going to have a quick look at now. And caves are chthonic spaces, which basically means that they are of the earth. And throughout folklore and mythology, caves are either the home of the dead or they're an entrance to either the underworld or the other world. So they appear in Greek mythology quite a lot as an entrance to the underworld. They are also what's called a liminal place or a between place, where they're both underground, but they're also open to the air. So they're not quite one or the other. And it could be, this is just a theory, but it could be that people believe that the dead or other spirits could then access our world via the caves. So that would explain why the marks were inside the caves, because those making them treated the caves themselves as the threshold, not the entryways into the caves. Perkins also pointed out that witch marks often appear in groups of 3 to harness the power of the Trinity, which could also help to explain the sheer numbers of marks in the caves as well. And it is, of course, possible that people then added new marks whenever they found something new that they were wanting to fear. So basically, whether they're designed to keep fairies, demons, witches, or ghosts at bay, the intention remains the same across all of these, that the marks are a very human attempt to say, don't cross this line. Or were they indeed intended to do more than actually keep evil out? So for Ronald Hutton, something evil may have been driven into the caves by the people, and then the marks held them there. And a chamber inside the Robin Hood cave is known as the demon's prison cell as a result. So it is believed that some of the boxes or mazes among the marks were actually designed to trap evil. And the mesh or grid is sometimes referred to as a Jacob's ladder. And experts do disagree as to their function, but it is possible that they were intended as spirit traps, because according to folklore, there's a belief that spirits can only travel in straight lines. So the idea was that they would get so fascinated by tracing these straight lines that they would essentially just get stuck there, tracing the mark over and over. And it's a way of kind of keeping them transfixed in a way. And in my head, it's a bit like giving a toddler a tablet to keep them quiet. It's sort of like, just trace this on the wall and leave everybody alone. But it stops them from wreaking havoc on the living. So were the local people trying to keep ghosts or other malevolent spirits inside the caves, or were they trying to prevent evil things in the caves from then actually getting out and getting beyond the underworld? We'll never know for certain. It's one of those lovely things. We don't know, because writers contemporary to the marks didn't write about folk magic or practices from the lower classes. And where the knowledge needed to create such marks has faded from folk memory, we now basically have to do our best at recreating it with what we know now. What I can say is that these marks are easy enough to make and use. A simple X or saltire will do the trick in many cases. And when restrictions ease, we'll be able to go and visit Creswell Crags to actually see the marks for ourselves and make up our own minds. But just try and leave the ghosts where you found them, if you do. And finally, Merry Christmas to everybody on the back of that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Icy. That was fantastic. And thank you for the plug of our witch mark tours at the end there as well. We will be running those again as soon as possible, actually. For anyone who's interested in visiting, we've discovered that you can run quite a good socially distanced witch mark tour. So as soon as regulations allow us to start doing that, we'll be running private cave tours again that you'll be able to book in advance and come with just your family. So get lots of time to see if the ghosts appear. So that was so fascinating. And do you know, I'd not even made the connection with the Christmas Carol, which is really interesting. We've got a couple of questions that came through the chat and the Q&A, which, I mean, you've probably seen yourself. They're both linked, actually. One is, are there any modern Christmas ghost stories? And the other one is, have you got a modern sort of ghost story writer, but in the style of James and Dickens? So they're similar questions, really.
I think modern's always one of those really awkward terms, because it's like, when does modern start? And that's just me being awkward there. I think it's hard because obviously lots of writers will try and do a Christmas ghost story. I can't think of any off the top of my head of anyone who does them religiously. The closest to it really would be Mark Gatiss, because of the number that he's done on TV. And I mean, I know he sort of deviated from ghosts last year with Dracula, which seemed to divide viewers. I personally enjoyed it, but He's probably the closest I can think of to somebody sort of trying to keep that tradition going, because I know he did one that was an original story that was The Dead Room with Simon Callow, set in a radio station. That was quite creepy. So he's the closest I can think of. So he's obviously then taken his storytelling into his medium, which obviously would be film and television.
Fantastic. I'm just trying to say, has anybody else got any questions? That's the only question we actually had come through. Well,
I've
two
got some
questions.
comments about Muppets as well.
Yeah, but your views on the Muppet Christmas Carol were divisive at the start of that there. No arguments about Alan Rickman though. So that was a good reference, because Creswell Crags is of course in the historic Sherwood Forest. So that was the perfect reference there. Oh, we have another question. Are there any stories you would recommend as particularly resonant for 2020?
Oh, it's really annoying. The only one that's popped into my head is completely the worst one I could recommend. That would be The Stand by Stephen King. I don't know, it's difficult because 2020 has been a weird year in so many ways. I think you would have to go back to the Edwardian period and kind of look at the stories around like the 1918 to 1920 sort of period to find anything that was, you know, in any way similar. And it's hilarious when you read news stories from the article of, you know, from that period, and you know, writers are complaining about people refusing to wear their masks outside and things like that. And it's like, oh, wow, humans don't learn. So I can't think of any specific ones that would be resonant. I think really anything that deals with kind of like a mass sort of interruption of how we normally do things. And I mean, ultimately, that's what ghosts are. Ghosts are disruptive. They are supposed to, you know, people are supposed to stay in the past, and they don't. They come forward into the present. So really, any, yeah, I've just seen Upstart Crow there. It is really good. Any ghost stories are ultimately disruptive. So I think they're all particularly resonant for 2020.
That's really interesting, actually. It's a really good answer. Yeah, Upstart Crow, that is amazing, actually. Dickens and Shakespeare, all in one amazing comedy. So will you be telling ghost stories at Christmas?
Probably. I mean, as I say, I did the event yesterday where I told 3 short stories, and one of them is actually set at Christmas, which is unusual for me. But then there's also an event as part of the Romance in the Gothic community where we're gathering on Christmas Eve to tell ghost stories, and some people are going to tell like their favorite, and I'm actually going to be telling some from my time as a ghost hunter, so they're going to be like actual, oh my god, this happened sort of thing. So that should be fun.
Oh, where was the best place that you went hunting ghosts?
Oh, I'm going to have to say the Castle Keep in Newcastle. I mean, it dates to like 1067, so a lot has happened in that building. And it was the one I also did the most investigations in as well, so you kind of build up like a real sense for what's actually there.
Brilliant. Has anybody else got any questions? Before we let Icy go. Yeah, Ben's pointed out in the chat that actually quite a lot of our contributors to the festival are exploring ideas around isolation in the middle of winter. It's an interesting thing, isn't it, as well, because in the publicity for this entire festival, I've been torn between publicising it as keeping the darkness out in the middle of a really dark year, but actually celebrating the darkness as well. And that's an interesting tension of sort of that isolation and the darkness can actually be a time to explore and to celebrate as much as it is a sort of a thing you want to keep away. And I think we've got bits of both of that in the whole of this festival, actually. And I guess ghost stories are a very similar thing as well, aren't they?
I mean, one of the huge themes of the Gothic as a literary mode is isolation and how people cope with it. So it is really quite sort of common to a lot of the stories.
Brilliant. I could talk about the Gothic all day, but let's not do that with while everyone's here. Are there any final questions before we end the session? I'm not seeing anything else coming in, so I'm guessing everybody's satisfied. It was a brilliant talk. Thank you, Icy. It was really fascinating. I'd just like to say to everyone, there is going to be content appearing over the entire, over the rest of the weekend. Our programme, there's a PDF of our programme through the link that you'll see that takes you to our website that tells you when things are going to be appearing. Most things are via our Vimeo platform, so do go and have a look there. There's some brilliant content. Hopefully we'll do this again next year as well. And Icy, maybe you can come to Creswell Crags in person next year. You never know. So that'd be amazing. And Ben's just shared the Vimeo link there as well for everybody, so you can access all the rest of the content too. Thank you so much, Icy. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you to Ben, who's been there in the comments and the questions helping. And thank you to all of our attendees too. It's been absolutely fabulous. As soon as I end this, it will just kick you all out. So if you've got any last things to say them